Hey there, and welcome to my second video. In this video I wanted to talk to you guys a bit about capitalism. I learned some stuff about it which quite honestly blew my mind. I thought it was a different and very new perspective, and I wanted to share it with you guys. I think most people have never heard about this stuff. I certainly never did, and so I thought it could be interesting. And while I was learning about this stuff, also I couldn't help imagine that if capitalism was a person, they'd be stressed out of their mind, and rightly so. And they would be worrying constantly about when is it gonna come crashing down, or it's gonna fall apart at any moment. And I think for most people, economy and capitalism and stuff like that isn't very interesting. It was never really interesting for me either. But I read this book called Sapiens, and it is written by Yuval Noah Harari, which for sure I butchered. And this is an incredible book. It quite honestly blew my mind multiple times and was really interesting. And it has actually nothing to do really with economy or capitalism, but what it does is it goes through human history. It starts at the beginning and explains all the developments and all the different things that have shaped humanity. But in a certain part of this book, at one point, the author starts to explain the economy and how it was created. And this is where I got basically everything that I'm going to talk today. All of that stuff I got from there. So I would recommend anyone, if you have the motivation, because it's quite, it's still a little bit thick. If you have the motivation and you're interested, you should definitely read this book. I highly recommend it. I had always been aware of the basics, stuff like supply and demand, inflation, competition, stuff like that. But this book, it went even deeper, and I don't mean deeper in the sense that it went into a lot of detail, but it went deeper in the sense that it explained the fundamental ideas behind our modern economy that I feel we never really heard about, or that we come to think of. And these fundamental principles, or these fundamental ideas, are actually what make possible growth, innovation, and all of the things that do come to mind when we think about capitalism. But as we go along in this video, I think you will realize how wobbly, or not wobbly, but how dependent this system is of us and of the fact that we follow some common rules. And if a person's existence would depend on these kinds of principles, then they'd be pretty stressed, and rightfully so, if you ask me. But also, while we're still a bit at the beginning of the video, I want to make it crystal clear that I'm in no way criticizing our modern economy or how it is functioning. This is not at all the point. Also, when I do the comparison that if capitalism was a person, they'd have anxiety, this is just something that is a bit funny to think of. But at the end of the day, capitalism or our economy is not a person. And so you could easily argue, who cares if they would have anxiety if there was a person, because they are not one. And I think that argument is completely valid. Like, who cares what feelings capitalism would have if it was a person? I just thought it was funny to think of it that way. Like, if my existence was that wobbly, for sure I would not be able to go to sleep at night. First, I would like to start by explaining how the banks manage to keep our economy growing and flourishing, or at least most of the time. And I'm going to do this with an example. And I think once we get into it, you're going to start to see why there is reason for some anxiety. This example is also the same way it was explained to me by this author here. And I thought it was a really clever way of explaining it, and so I'm going to do the same. First, let's imagine a carpenter, and we're going to call him Mr. Carpenter. Mr. Carpenter just finished building a house, which he received a payment for $1 million. He then takes his $1 million to the bank where he deposits it, and when he goes home to check his account, he can see $1 million in his account. And the bank now also has in their vault or wherever, they have $1 million, his $1 million. Then there is a lady, and she sees a business opportunity, and so she wants to open up a bakery. Let's call her Mrs. Muffin. The only problem is that Mrs. Muffin doesn't have the money to get started. So she goes to the bank and asks for a loan of $1 million. The bank approves the loan and gives her the $1 million. With these $1 million in her account, she then pays Mr. Carpenter to build her the bakery, which she does. So he gets the payment from Mrs. Muffin and now will have $2 million in his account. But in reality, the bank still only possesses the $1 million, the original $1 million from Mr. Carpenter. The second $1 million doesn't actually exist yet, even though Mr. Carpenter clearly sees it in his account. This money was basically conjured up by the bank in order to finance the loan of Mrs. Muffin. And this process that I just explained, I believe it can be repeated 8 more times legally by the banks. Meaning that the actual money that the bank owns might be $1 million, but there is $10 million going around in people's account that the bank doesn't have. Current US banking law permits a bank to loan out $10 for every single dollar, every $1 that they actually possess. So what happens when people try to withdraw the total of $10 million when the bank in fact only possesses $1 million? Well, the bank would immediately collapse unless, of course, the government steps in and saves the bank. And people wouldn't be able to get their money, not because the bank doesn't want to give it to them, but because the money that they thought they had never existed. And this is true basically for all the banks like Citibank, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, etc., etc. So people might be running around spending money from their accounts when 90% of the money that they see in their account doesn't actually exist and has never existed. But people are nonetheless running around spending it. This all, of course, sounds a bit crazy and a bit irresponsible and a bit like a Ponzi scheme or like a giant Ponzi scheme. And if it were, then it would mean that our entire economy would be based on fraud. However, this is not the case. This is, however, a demonstration of the amazing ability and creativity of the human imagination. Let me explain. What enables our bank or our banks and our economy to work and to keep this going is our trust in the future. And the future is the backing for all this made up money, which could be up to 90% of all circulating money. In the bakery example, the $1 million discrepancy between the $2 million in the bank account of the Mr. Carpenter and the $1 million that the bank possesses, the $1 million difference lies in the bakery. The bank has put money into the asset, trusting that in the future it will be a very profitable bakery, even though it has still not baked a single loaf of bread. So once Mrs. Muffin starts baking her bread and starts making a profit, she can then pay back her loan, with interest of course, and first then does the $1 million that is missing actually come into existence. And if, at this point, when Mrs. Muffin has paid everything back with her interest, if then Mr. Carpenter wants to withdraw his $2 million, he will finally be able to. The entire business and all the parties that are involved are completely dependent on that in the future the money will be made into existence. But the bakery might succeed, but it also might not. And this is what is the risky part, of course. And so up to 90% of all the money in the world and up to 90% of all the money in your account might not exist and is only backed by the idea that in the future this money or this value will have come into existence. Or in other words, paid back. Hard to imagine how this could ever go wrong, of course. Personally, I never really took the time to try and understand too much about economics or look into it. I was never really interested. But when it was presented to me in this way, with this example, it was kind of eye-opening. I mean, some people maybe already knew this, like all the finance bros and stuff. And I kind of already knew, or I think most people already know, that every once in a while banks fuck up and suddenly people cannot get their money, and they do maybe a bit of shady stuff sometimes. But I never imagined it or saw it really this clearly or through this perspective. And for me, it was completely mind blowing to learn that up to 90% of all the money in the world basically could be fake and exist only through debt. I mean, maybe I would have been generous to guess that it's like 30% or maybe even 50, but I would never have imagined that up to 90% of all the money circulating around in the world is fake or is not existing except through debt. Like, I don't know why, but I always thought that when you take out a loan, the money that you get is money that the bank has, and the bank gives you some of their money, and for the trouble, you need to pay an interest. Which to me seems a bit more responsible and a bit less anxiety inducing. But instead, we have this situation where maybe up to 90% of the money in the world is taken from the future, basically, and will not come to exist until it is paid back. And I really apologize if the author got this stuff wrong and I'm just sitting here regurgitating false information. And if that's the case, I'm really sorry. But it turns out that this but this is actually the case, and the stuff works like that. And we could also see it from a different perspective and see how this is really a testament to the incredible power and the creativity and the imagination of the human mind to think of something like this and to make it work also. Now, to some of you, this might seem like very irresponsible and risky, but if we look at it if we look at this faith in the future based economy from a historical perspective, then I think we quickly see the positive. It's not just some anxiety-inducing bubble waiting to burst. It has its use and quite an incredible potential. Before the modern era, credit like this was never really a possibility, and so for most of our history, growth was very limited. All that money could represent was things that already existed and that were in the present. Back in the day, we never had the luxury of using money that represented future potential. So in the past, entrepreneurs were basically just screwed. Like in our example that we had with the bakery and Mrs. Muffin and her dream of opening a bakery, it would never have happened without the loan. It would only have stayed a dream. Because without the bakery, Mrs. Muffin can't bake any cakes. If she cannot bake any cakes, she cannot make any money. If she cannot make any money, she cannot hire Mr. Carpenter. And if she cannot hire Mr. Carpenter, she cannot have a bakery. And the way us humans found a way around this predicament was through trust in the future. We figured out that we can represent future riches in the present through credit. And with this new invention, we could build and make stuff in the present at the expense of the future. I found this really interesting because nowadays loans and credit is so common. I mean, almost everyone will use it in one point during their life, except if you're really loaded, of course. Actually, even if you're really loaded, you might still use a loan and credit for tax purposes or whatever. And so now you might think, wait, hold on a second, credit is not some kind of modern era invention at all. And you're completely right. I mean, of course, people thought about this all the way back in ancient times. But so why did it take all the way until our modern era to actually take off? The problem wasn't that people didn't think of it or didn't know how to use it. The problem was that you could never trust that the future would be any better than the present. In fact, most of the time throughout our human history, people thought that the best case scenario was that stuff stayed the same and just doesn't get any worse. What this meant in economic terms is that the total amount of wealth was limited. The pie stayed the same size or it even shrunk. This also meant that if the pie doesn't grow and in the best case scenario it only stays the same year after year, then business becomes a zero-sum game. And this had another implication that we no longer think about. Like if you imagine there's only a limited amount of wealth to go around, then making a profit can only be done at the expense of others. By getting rich, someone else basically had to get poor. because taking a bigger piece of the pie means that there's less left for the others. And this is also the reason why in many cultures making a profit or becoming wealthy was considered sinful. And so the rich were obliged to do penance for their evil profits and were supposed to give to charity. If the global pie stays the same, then there is really no room for any credit, and giving out loans is just an idiotic risk in this case. And so entrepreneurship was basically impossible, and any poor people that had dreams of moving up in society could only dream as long as credit was not a thing. Basically, before the modern economy, it was no credit, no business. No business meant no growing economy. No growing economy meant it was not worth giving credit. And so, because the economy didn't grow by itself, people didn't expect it to grow either, and the expectation fulfilled itself. Now, how did we ever manage to really make it out of this vicious cycle of a stagnant economy? Well, basically what happened was the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution started off by us saying we don't know everything, and this allowed us to discover all kinds of crazy stuff afterwards. So by investing resources in research, we could improve the future and create new value, finally adding to the pie, making the pie grow larger. New things were created, and they didn't take away from what was previously there. At least overall, it was adding more than it was taking away. Now, I think it's time for another bakery example to show how the scientific revolution created economic opportunity. Basically, it meant someone could open up a bakery specializing in cakes without making a bakery specializing in bread go bust. I realize how often I'm mentioning cakes, pies, and bakeries in this video, and I think if I do it anymore, YouTube's gonna start to think this is some kind of cooking channel or baking channel. But I thought these examples were really good, and so I wanted to use them. And also, I mean, let's be honest, who doesn't like cake? But getting back to credit, economy, and the scientific revolution, something incredible was created, basically. Finally, you could become wealthy without someone else getting poor. Also, I want to make clear that obviously credit is not some sort of saint or whatever. It can go wrong, and it often does also, to be honest. But if you kind of zoom out and you look in the long run for humanity with all the ups and downs, overall, it brought real economic growth. Once people started to put more faith in the future, the credit grew, which in turn grew or increased the economic growth. The economic growth then in turn increased the trust in the future, which increased credit. And we have the scientists and the people of the scientific revolution to thank for getting the ball rolling. But so now we are kind of stuck where if we let the progress stop or the innovation stop, then we stagnate, and so does the economy. And so we are kind of stuck in this cycle where we cannot allow the scientific revolution to ever slow down. Once the growth stops, the economy stops. Next up, I wanted to talk a bit about the idea and when it occurred and how it occurred that profit could actually be altruistic. So in 1776, there was a brilliant economist called Adam Smith, and he published arguably the most important economic manifesto of all time, which is called The Wealth of Nations. He basically made the argument that when an entrepreneur makes a profit, then they use this profit to make more profit by, for example, hiring more people. And hiring more people would mean more salaries. And so with this, he argues that the profit of private entrepreneurs gives rise to or leads to more collective wealth and more collective prosperity. For us, I mean, living in our time, this doesn't really seem like any groundbreaking idea at all, or even doesn't really seem like an very original idea. I mean, we all live and have grown up in a world where this idea is taken for granted and that it works like that, of course. And although for us this idea is nothing groundbreaking or special, when Smith made the claim, it was groundbreaking. He basically claimed that the selfish selfish urge to make profit was the basis for the collective wealth. And this was not just revolutionary on the economic front, but also on the moral one. Because if you remember, it used to be, or throughout our history, a bit sinful making a profit, because your profit meant that someone else was losing. You getting rich meant that someone else was getting poor. In a way, Smith makes the argument that greed is good, and that by getting rich, you're not just benefiting yourself, but you're also benefiting others. And so with this, egoism became altruism. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but for me this still, during our day and age, this still seems very bold to say, and so I can only imagine how bold it was to say this back then. And personally, even though I never really was interested in economy and stuff like that, I don't know, maybe I'm just nerdy, but I found this stuff really interesting. Smith, in a way, denied the age-old contradiction between wealth and morality. And with this, the economy could also become a win-win situation for people. Now, at this point, I also think it's important to point out that in Smith's story, or in Smith's argument, the rich people get rich by growing the pie. They don't get rich by robbing others. For this idea, or this narrative, or this whatever you would like to call it, to work, that Smith came up with, there is a catch. And of course there is a catch. I mean, good things are never without a catch. For it to work, the rich need to, and are required to, spend their profits on building new factories, hiring new employees, etc., etc. They need to not waste their profits on non-productive activities. And this is a crucial, absolutely crucial part of our capitalistic economy. Profits ought to be reinvested in the production, which will bring about more profits, which will then also be reinvested to keep the machine going. And like we said earlier, these things, they all seem a bit obvious to us now, but during most of the human history, people never thought this would be a possibility. And you might say, but look at all these rich people flying around in private jets and wearing expensive clothes and whatnot. That doesn't really seem like any productive activities, and it doesn't seem to be growing the size of the pie, and it doesn't seem to be increasing collective wealth. And you're right, you're completely right. Far from all profits are spent in the ideal way that Adam Smith proposes. And also, theories, they never really turn out the way they were supposed to, or not exactly the way they were supposed to when you apply them in real life. But taking a venture capitalist, for example. Yes, this person might be flying around in private jets from time to time. They might also wear, I don't know, an expensive Versace suit or whatever. But these people also run or rush from one business meeting to another, looking for where to invest their capital. And the expenses of these unproductive activities like jets and suits is like nothing compared to the ungodly amounts that they invest in companies, factories, and production. And at the end of the day, this production is going to keep the economy going. It's going to lead to the size of the pie growing, and it's going to lead to collective wealth. But obviously, assuming that with the investing profits, the growth can keep on going forever is a bit naive as well. After all, just because you invest your profit or because you invest in something doesn't mean that it's going to make you a profit of any kind. And it's even more foolish to assume that resources will continue to expand indefinitely. You know, the laws of nature don't really tend to allow for stuff like that. However, the modern economy has managed to sustain its growth relying on the scientific discoveries. So while governments and banks basically spend their days printing money, representing value that doesn't exist, the responsibility then falls on the innovators and the scientists to make sure that the money that was conjured out of thin air comes into existence. And this they do through new inventions and through trying to grow the pie. Governments and banks basically pump the system full of credit and then hope that scientists and inventors and entrepreneurs come up with something really big that will pay back those credits before the bubble bursts. And if the entrepreneurs and the people in lab coats cannot fulfill these expectations, then we're kind of in for some really rough times. In short, our capitalist economy, or our modern capitalist economy, has allowed us to reach an unfathomable potential, but it's not without its risks. There are certain rules that we need to follow, and if we don't follow these rules, then this economic machine that we have built stops and it falls apart. We have tapped into the future. We are borrowing money from the future, money which does not yet exist, and we call this credit. And we even go so far so that up to 90% of all the money that is existing and that is circulating around, it is not representing any real value that is out there in the real world. The value doesn't exist yet. It's just credit and will have to be paid back. This is also money that you cannot withdraw. It's basically just represented as numbers on a screen, and we use it every day. As long as we keep innovating and we keep creating new things that can pay back this credit, we're gonna be okay. As long as people don't try to withdraw all their money which the bank doesn't have, then we're also gonna be okay. And lastly, as long as profits are not hoarded and spent on unproductive activities and are reinvested, then we're gonna be okay. If we can manage to follow these rules, then the machine will keep on working, everything is gonna keep going as it has been, and we'll be fine. Obviously, this is stressful to think about, and especially if you think about it in this way. And I don't think we should think about it too much either. I don't think it's good for you. And there's not much you can do about it either. And to be honest, even if you could do anything about it, I don't think you would even know what to do. I certainly wouldn't have any clue. I'm just really happy it works. And to be honest, I'm really appreciative and thankful for what it has allowed us to accomplish, without, of course, discrediting all the screw-ups and disasters that it has also caused in the past, and that is also causing still for some people. Anyways, that was all for me today. I really enjoyed learning about this stuff, and I hope it was interesting for someone else as well. I thought it was a new perspective and a new way to see capitalism, and new way to see something that we're normally all very familiar with. So that was interesting. And if anyone's interested, they should definitely read the book. It was very good. I highly recommend it. Also, an extra big thank you to you if you made it to the end of the video. Thank you. It was quite a long one, once again. And yeah, until next time. Bye.